The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the Fort Braxton shooting range, turning the concrete lanes into shimmering heat traps that would test even the most seasoned marksman. Rachel Hayes adjusted her faded contractor badge and wiped sweat from her forehead, her civilian cargo pants already showing dark stains despite the early hour. Around her, the controlled chaos of military training unfolded with practiced precision. The rhythmic crack of rifles, the metallic ping of spent brass hitting stone, and the sharp voices of instructors who knew that sloppy habits in training became fatal mistakes in the field. Rachel worked methodically along the equipment bench, a toolkit spread beside her with the obsessive organization that spoke of years doing work where a misplaced screwdriver could cost someone their life. The ID badge clipped to her shirt read simply, Advanced Optics Solutions, Civilian Calibration Technician. It was the kind of credential that made her invisible to people with more important things on their minds, which was exactly how she preferred it. For the better part of an hour, she'd been adjusting a finicky scope mount, making corrections measured in thousandths of an inch with tools that cost more than most soldiers made in a month. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Just the quiet competence of someone who'd learned that half measures got people killed. The group of young Army snipers sprawled in the shade nearby might as well have been looking through her. They had that lean, sunburned arrogance that came with being the best shots in their unit, combined with the casual cruelty of 20-somethings who'd never been properly humbled. Jesus, did someone's grandmother wander into the wrong building? Private Tommy Morrison said, loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. His buddy, a redhead named Kevin Murphy with arms like fence posts, squinted theatrically in Rachel's direction. That's not a toolkit, Murphy added with a grin. That's her sewing kit. Think she's here to hem our uniforms? The laughter that followed had that particular edge of young men performing for each other, each joke needing to be a little crueler than the last to get the same reaction. Rachel kept her safety glasses on and her attention on the scope mount. She'd heard worse from better men than these. The adjustment she was making required her full concentration. Anyway, a single click too far in either direction would throw the zero off by meters at long range. But she wasn't deaf to the commentary floating over the range noise. $20 says she used to be a school secretary, Morrison continued. Nah, definitely a librarian, Murphy countered. Look at those reading glasses. Probably shushes. People for a living. As she worked, Rachel noticed things. The way Morrison's rifle was leaning against the bench, bolt closed on an empty chamber, which was sloppy field discipline. The carbon buildup on Corporal James Hayes's muzzle brake that would throw his point of impact left by at least half a meter at distance. Small details that spoke of training shortcuts and equipment neglect. She also noticed that none of them had bothered to check their data cards for current atmospheric conditions. The temperature had risen 8 degrees since morning. Humidity had dropped and barometric pressure was falling. At long range, those variables could turn a perfect shot into a complete miss. But that wasn't her job to fix. She was here for the scopes, nothing more. Staff Sergeant Michael Bryce emerged from the equipment shed with the casual authority of someone who'd figured out that being loud was easier than being right. Early 30s, regulation haircut that looked like it cost more than his boots. Sleeves rolled to display qualification badges he'd earned in exercises most of these kids had never heard of. He carried a clipboard like it was Excalibur. He took one look at Rachel's setup and made a visible effort not to scowl. This lane's restricted during qualification runs. Rachel didn't look up from the scope she was adjusting. Your commanding officer signed the work order himself. She tapped a sealed packet beside her toolkit, official paperwork with stamps and signatures that would hold up under scrutiny. Bryce's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue with proper authorization. Instead, he found another angle. Just Don't get in the way when we start the serious shooting." The comment got another chuckle from his audience, though it felt forced now, like they were working harder to maintain the joke than it deserved. Rachel finished her adjustment and moved to the next rifle, a Barrett that someone had clearly been abusing. The bolt was gritty, the scope rings were loose, and the muzzle brake showed carbon buildup that would affect accuracy. She began her work with the same methodical patience, cleaning and adjusting with movements that were precise without being showy. There was something almost meditative about her process, a rhythm that suggested muscle memory built over years of repetition. Across the range, Sergeant First Class David Cross was watching the whole exchange from behind a spotting scope. American, Marine attached to the joint training exercise, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending years in places where the sun was an enemy and the wind told you things you needed to know to stay alive. He'd been calling shots for Army snipers all morning, but something about the woman at the equipment bench had caught his attention. It wasn't her tools, though they were clearly better than standard issue. It wasn't her technique, though she worked with obvious competence. It was something in the way she moved, the economy of motion, the absolute certainty in her hand placement, the way she never had to look twice to find what she needed. Cross had seen that kind of muscle memory before, in places he wasn't supposed to talk about. He'd also been listening to the commentary from the young soldiers, and it was starting to grate on him. He'd served with enough different units to recognize real competence when he saw it, and he'd learned the hard way that the people you underestimated were usually the ones who ended up saving your life. "Murphy," he called out to the redhead, "when's the last time you cleaned that muzzle brake?" Murphy looked confused. "Yesterday, Sergeant." "Yesterday when?" "Before or after you fired 60 rounds through it?" "After, I think." "You think?" Cross's voice carried that particular edge that made junior enlisted suddenly pay attention. "Walk over here and look through this scope. Tell me what you see on your rifle." Murphy approached reluctantly and peered through Cross's spotting scope, which was trained on his weapon. Even at 20 meters, the carbon fouling was visible around the brake ports. "That's not clean, soldier." I ran a patch through it and called it good." Cross's voice was quiet but carried clearly across the bay. "At 800 meters, that buildup will throw your shot off by 6 inches. At longer range, you might as well be throwing rocks." The laughter from the group died down considerably. Nothing killed military humor faster than being reminded that sloppy work had consequences that went beyond embarrassment. The morning wore on with the usual rhythm of military training. Brief periods of intense focus punctuated by longer stretches of waiting, adjusting, and trying not to melt in the heat. Rachel continued her work, invisible to most, but drawing increasingly curious glances from the few who knew enough to recognize precision when they saw it. Around midday, when the heat had reached that shimmering intensity that made distant targets dance like mirages, Staff Sergeant Bryce decided to provide some entertainment for his troops. "You know what?" he announced, loud enough to carry across the bay. "Why don't we see what our calibration expert can do with all that fancy equipment she's been fussing over?" A few heads turned, sensing opportunity for amusement. This was the moment Rachel had been dreading since she'd first heard the snickers. She looked up from the cleaning kit she'd been using on a rifle bolt, her expression carefully neutral. "I'm here to service equipment, not fire it." "Come on," Bryce pressed, warming to his theme. "All that careful adjustment work. Don't. You want to see if it actually works?" Someone in the back called out, "Give her something light. Wouldn't want her to hurt herself." More laughter, though it was starting to sound hollow in the heat. Rachel set down her cleaning rod and considered the request with the kind of careful attention she'd been giving the rifle scopes all morning. No anger, no offense taken, just professional evaluation of a situation that had taken an unexpected turn. The trap was being set, and she knew it. But sometimes, Rachel had learned, the best way out of a trap was straight through it. "What did you have in mind?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough curiosity to keep things interesting. Bryce's grin widened as he gestured toward the Barrett she'd just finished servicing. "Let's see what you can do with that beauty." "Nothing fancy. Just hit the 800-meter target, and we'll all be impressed." The suggestion drew more attention. Other shooters drifted over, drawn by the promise of watching a civilian contractor try to handle serious military hardware. The Barrett was no joke, a .338 Lapoa Magnum that could put a hole through an engine block at 2 miles in the right hands. In the wrong hands, it would knock someone flat and probably leave them with a dislocated shoulder. Rachel walked over to where the rifle sat on its bipod, studying it like she was reading fine print. The weight of every eye on the range pressed against her shoulders, but she'd felt that kind of a tension before. The difference was that back then, missing hadn't just meant embarrassment. It had meant people died. She picked up the Barrett, not gingerly like someone handling something foreign, but with the casual familiarity of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. The weight settled into her hands like it belonged there. 30 pounds of precision engineering that most people would struggle to even lift properly. Cross, still watching from his spotting position, felt something click in his memory. The way she shouldered the rifle, the automatic check of the safety, the finger discipline that never put her index finger near the trigger until she was ready to shoot. These weren't learned responses from a weekend shooting course. They were hardwired reflexes, burned into muscle memory through repetition under pressure. "You need a spotter," he called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of gathering spectators. Rachel glanced over at him, and for just a moment, their eyes met with the kind of recognition that passed between professionals who understood each other without needing words. "If you can keep up," she said simply. Cross felt his pulse quicken. There was something in that response, a confidence. That had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with experience. He moved to his spotting scope, making quick adjustments for the changing light and wind conditions that had shifted since morning. "What's your target?" Bryce was still grinning, enjoying the show he'd orchestrated. The 800-meter. Board should be a nice challenge for someone who usually works with screwdrivers, Morrison added, drawing a few more chuckles from the growing crowd. But Cross was looking through his scope at something else entirely. The range had targets set at various distances for different training scenarios, but the farthest board was way beyond the standard markers. He could barely make it out through the heat shimmer, a tiny speck that would challenge even their best shooters under perfect conditions. "There's a target at 3,285 meters, he said quietly, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an observable fact. "Long-range practice board." The casual way he mentioned that distance made several people stop what they were doing and stare. 3,000 meters was beyond the effective range of most military snipers. It was the kind of distance where you needed perfect conditions, perfect equipment, and years of experience to even come close. Rachel nodded like this was perfectly normal information. Wind conditions? Light and variable, maybe 3 knots from the northwest. Mirage is heavy. It'll throw off your point of aim by at least 2 meters at that distance. The technical discussion of extreme long-range shooting made the gathered soldiers exchange uncertain glances. This wasn't the amateur hour they'd been expecting to witness. These two were talking like professionals discussing routine work parameters. "She's not seriously considering that distance," someone whispered. "Has to be a joke." But Rachel was already moving to the shooting mat, settling into position with movements that looked almost choreographed in their precision. She adjusted the bipod legs with tiny corrections, found her natural point of aim, and began the breathing routine that every sniper learned but few ever truly mastered. The range went quiet. not the commanded silence of official business, but the organic hush that falls when everyone suddenly realizes they're witnessing something significant. The earlier mockery evaporated like morning dew, replaced by the kind of focused attention that comes when people sense they're about to see something they'll remember for the rest of their lives. Morrison stepped closer to Murphy, lowering his voice. 3,000 meters in this heat? Even our instructors don't attempt shots over 2,000. Bryce felt his earlier confidence beginning to waver. What had started as a harmless bit of fun was taking on dimensions he hadn't anticipated. The woman on the shooting mat wasn't acting like someone out of her depth. She was moving with the kind of deliberate preparation that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. Cross made final adjustments to his spotting scope, calculating wind drift, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, and a dozen other variables that could turn a perfect shot into a complete miss at extreme range. His voice, when he called the conditions, carried the crisp professionalism of someone who'd done this in places where missing wasn't just embarrassing. It was fatal. Winds dropping to almost nothing. Mirage is steady, reading about 2 meters left of center. Range 3,285 meters confirmed. Behind them, the whispered conversations of soldiers who had finally realized this. Wasn't entertainment anymore drifted across the range like smoke. She's actually going to try it. At that distance? In this heat? Maybe we should stop this before someone gets hurt. Bryce stepped closer, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Ma'am, you don't have to prove anything. The 800-meter target is perfectly adequate for a demonstration. I'm fine. Rachel cut him off without taking her eye from the scope. Her voice carried the calm finality of someone who'd made a decision and wasn't interested in debate. Cross recognized that tone. He'd heard it from operators who'd moved beyond doubt into the zone where everything became simple. Target. Conditions shot. Everything else was just noise. Rachel's breathing slowed to the kind of controlled respiration that lowered heart rate, steadied hands, and created the perfect moment between heartbeats when the body was absolutely still. Through his spotting scope, Cross could see the heat shimmer distorting the air like liquid glass. At this distance, that mirage would bend light rays and throw off the point of impact by meters if not properly compensated. Most shooters would never even attempt to calculate it. But Rachel had already made her adjustments. Tiny corrections that spoke of understanding atmospheric conditions at a level that went far beyond basic marksmanship training. The silence stretched tight as a say. Wire. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen when theory met reality at impossible range. Rachel took the slack out of the trigger, her finger finding that perfect pressure point where the slightest additional squeeze would send 38 grains of copper and led on a journey that would either validate years of whispered speculation or confirm everyone's initial assumptions about quiet women in contractor badges. In that suspended moment before the shot, Cross found himself wondering who Rachel really was and why someone with her obvious competence was content to remain invisible, calibrating other people's weapons instead of using her own. The question would have to wait. The trigger was about to answer a more immediate one. The shot, when it came, cracked across the range like thunder splitting the desert air. The big Barrett bucked against Rachel's shoulder with the kind of violent recoil that would have knocked most people sideways, but she rode it like she was part of the weapon system itself. Before the sound had even finished echoing off the concrete walls, she was already working the bolt for a potential follow-up shot, the brass casing ejecting in a perfect arc to land precisely where she could catch it. Cross stayed glued to his spotting scope, following the invisible trace of the bullet across the shimmering distance. At extreme range, there was always that eternal moment when the shot was in flight, but the result was unknown. Time stretched like taffy, while physics and ballistics played out their ancient dance. The seconds felt like hours. The gathered soldiers held their collective breath, straining to see what Cross could observe through his magnified optics. Heat waves rose from the concrete like ghosts, distorting everything beyond a few hundred meters into a wavering mirage. "Impact," Cross called, his voice carefully controlled despite what he was seeing. "Center mass." The silence that followed was complete and profound. Even the mechanical sounds of the range, the distant hum of ventilation systems, the rustle of equipment, the shuffle of boots on concrete, seemed to disappear into a vacuum of disbelief. "Confirm the distance," Bryce said, his earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. Cross double-checked his scope, verified the range markers, and recalculated the math that he'd already done twice. The target was exactly where he'd called it, and the bullet hole was exactly where it shouldn't have been possible for it to be. 3,285 meters, he confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of professional certainty. "Clean hit, dead center." Someone dropped a piece of equipment. The metallic clatter seemed obscenely loud in the sudden quiet, like a gunshot in a library. "That's not possible," one of the younger soldiers whispered, the words carrying all the conviction of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally challenged. "Not possible for us," Cross corrected quietly, his eyes still fixed on the distant target through his scope. "But then again, we're not her." Rachel worked the bolt and ejected the spent brass, catching it in her palm with the same practiced ease she'd shown all morning. She didn't celebrate, didn't gloat, didn't even smile, just safed the rifle and began the methodical process of clearing the chamber, following safety protocols that had probably been drilled into her since most of these soldiers were in elementary school. The implications of what they just witnessed began to sink in slowly, like water seeping through concrete. This wasn't a lucky shot or a freak accident. This was someone demonstrating a level of marksmanship that belonged in legend, not on a routine training range. Staff Sergeant Bryce found his voice, though it came out rougher than he'd intended. "Run it again." Cross looked confused. "Sergeant?" I said, "Run it again." One shot could be luck, wind pocket, atmospheric anomaly, whatever. "Let's see if she can repeat it." The request hung in the air like a challenge, but Rachel showed no sign of being offended by the implication that her shot might have been accidental. She looked up from the rifle she was clearing, meeting Bryce's eyes directly for the first time since the morning had begun. "You want me to shoot again?" "If you don't mind humoring us," Bryce said, though his tone had shifted from mockery to something approaching respect. Rachel considered this for a moment, then nodded with the same casual acceptance she'd shown all morning. "Different target, same distance?" "Different aiming point," Cross added, adjusting his spotting scope to a fresh target board at the same impossible range. "Conditions are changing too. Winds picked up to maybe 5 knots, still from the northwest. Mirage is getting worse with the heat." The second shot was even more impressive than the first, because now everyone knew what they were watching. This wasn't a fluke or a happy accident. This was someone demonstrating mastery of skills that most of them had only heard about in stories told by instructors who'd served in places they weren't allowed to talk about. Rachel settled back into position with the same methodical precision, made tiny adjustments based on Cross's updated wind call, controlled her breathing to that perfect stillness, and squeezed the trigger at the exact moment when all the variables aligned in a harmony that bordered on art. The rifle cracked. The bullet flew its impossible arc across the desert heat. Cross tracked it through his scope, watching for the telltale signs of impact at a distance that challenged the limits of human vision. "Impact," he called, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Dead center." Again. This time, the silence felt different. Not shock exactly, but recognition. The kind that came when you realized you were in the presence of someone whose skills, transcended normal categories and entered the realm of the exceptional. Murphy, the redhead who'd started the morning with jokes about sewing kits, stepped forward hesitantly. His earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by something approaching awe. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "how long have you been shooting?" Rachel finished safing the rifle and looked at him with the same neutral expression she'd maintained all morning. "Long enough," she said simply. It wasn't an answer that satisfied anyone's curiosity, but something in her tone suggested that pushing for more details wouldn't be welcome. Cross, however, was putting pieces together in his mind, pieces that were forming a picture he recognized from classified briefings and whispered conversations in secure facilities. One of the range instructors had approached with a tablet, accessing databases that required security clearances most people didn't have. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, inputting search parameters that would normally trigger security reviews and background checks. What came back made him blink hard and read it twice to make sure he wasn't imagining things. The information was fragmentary. Most of it was classified above his access level, but what he could see painted a picture that explained everything and nothing simultaneously. Contract work in places that didn't exist on maps. Training certifications that had been redacted. Performance evaluations that used terms like exceptional and unprecedented before disappearing behind security classifications. He looked up from the tablet to find Rachel watching him with the kind of steady gaze that suggested she knew exactly what he was reading and wasn't particularly concerned about it. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think we owe you an apology." Rachel shouldered her kit bag and looked around at the assembled soldiers, young faces that had gone from mockery to respect in the space of 2 rifle shots and a few minutes of impossible marksmanship. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had been there all morning, hidden beneath the surface of routine contractor work. "But you might consider paying attention before you make assumptions about people." The words weren't harsh, but they carried weight that went beyond simple criticism. This was someone who just demonstrated capabilities that redefined what was possible, offering advice that came from a perspective none of them could fully comprehend. As she walked toward the exit, Cross felt compelled to ask the question that had been building in his mind since the first impossible shot had found. "It's Mark." "Ma'am," he called out. "Who are you?" Rachel paused at the gate, her silhouette framed against the blazing afternoon sun. For a moment, it looked like she might actually answer, might provide some explanation for the skills they'd witnessed and the competence they'd underestimated. Instead, she adjusted her kit bag and offered the kind of response that raised more questions than it answered. "Someone who used to do this for a living," she said simply, in places where missing wasn't an option. Then she was gone, leaving behind a range full of soldiers who would never again assume that quiet competence was the same thing as limited capability, and who were beginning to understand that legends sometimes walked among them wearing nothing more impressive than faded contractor badges and civilian cargo pants. The afternoon training sessions continued, but the atmosphere on the range had fundamentally changed. The casual arrogance that had defined the morning was gone, replaced by a more thoughtful approach to everything from equipment handling to interpersonal assumptions. Word of Rachel's impossible shots was already spreading through the bases. Informal communication network, the kind of whispered conversations that happened in mess halls and barracks when people encountered something that didn't fit into normal categories. Cross found himself unable to concentrate on the routine, spotting work that filled the rest of his duty day. The image of Rachel's perfect shooting form kept replaying in his mind, along with nagging fragments of memory that suggested he'd encountered her work before, even if he'd never seen her face. During a break between training rotations, he approached the instructor who'd been checking the classified databases. Staff Sergeant Robert Chun was old-school military, The kind of career soldier who'd served in every conflict of the past 2 decades and had the security clearances to prove it. What exactly did you find in that database search? Cross asked quietly, making sure their conversation couldn't be overheard by the younger soldiers. Chung glanced around to ensure they had privacy, then pulled out his tablet again. Fragments. Mostly. Her contractor record goes back about 15 years, but most of it's redacted. What I can see suggests she's worked in every major theater of operations since Afghanistan. He scrolled through screens of partially blacked out text. Look at these performance evaluations. Exceptional long-range capabilities. Recommended. For specialized assignments, clearance level upgraded. Then it all goes dark around 5 years ago. Goes dark how? Complete classification. Whatever she was doing, it required security levels I don't have access to. The only reason I can see her current contractor status is because she's working on unclassified equipment maintenance. Cross. Studied the limited information visible on the screen. Between the redactions and classifications, it painted a picture of someone whose skills had been recognized at the highest levels of military command, then deliberately obscured from normal view. There's something else, Chun continued, lowering his voice further. I ran her name through some of the operational databases I do have access to. She shows up as a consultant or contractor in the background of some major operations. Never front and center, but always there when long-range precision work was required. He showed Cross a series of deployment records where Rachel's name appeared in equipment lists and contractor manifests, always in support roles, never as primary personnel. But the operations themselves were legendary among special forces communities. The kind of missions that saved lives and changed strategic outcomes through precise application of overwhelming skill. She's a ghost, Cross realized. Someone with capabilities that get called in when normal military channels aren't sufficient, but who stays invisible in the official records. That's what it looks like. And based on what we saw today, whoever's been hiring her has been getting their money's worth. Meanwhile, in the base commander's office, a different kind of conversation was taking place. Colonel Patricia Williams had been briefed on the day's events by multiple sources, each report more extraordinary than the last. As someone who'd spent 30 years in military service, she'd learned to be skeptical of stories that seemed too impressive to be true. But she'd also learned to pay attention when multiple reliable sources independently confirmed the same impossible details. Let me understand this correctly, she said to Bryce, who sat uncomfortably in the chair across from her desk. A civilian. Contractor demonstrated marksmanship capabilities that exceed anything in our training standards, using equipment she'd just finished calibrating, at ranges that most of our specialists wouldn't attempt under ideal conditions. Yes, ma'am. 2 shots, both at 3,285 meters, both perfect center hits. And your assessment of this contractor prior to today? Bryce shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, I assumed she was just another maintenance technician. Her credentials seemed routine. Her behavior was unremarkable. She gave no indication of having advanced combat skills. Colonel Williams accessed her own classified databases, inputting search parameters that went several levels deeper than what Chun had been able to access. What she found made her lean back in her chair with the expression of someone whose assumptions about reality had just been significantly adjusted. Staff Sergeant Bryce, she said quietly, this contractor has been involved in operations that are classified so far above your clearance level that I can't even tell you they exist. Her skills aren't just advanced. They're legendary among people who do this kind of work professionally. She turned her monitor so he could see the heavily redacted documents, though most of the important details were blacked out. The question isn't why she can shoot like that. The question is why someone with her capabilities is content to remain invisible, calibrating other people's weapons. The answer to that question was something Rachel herself was contemplating as she drove away from the base in her unremarkable civilian vehicle. The day had gone differently than she'd planned. Routine maintenance work had turned into an unwanted demonstration that would inevitably generate attention she preferred to avoid. But sometimes, she reflected, certain lessons needed to be taught. The young soldiers who'd started the morning with casual mockery had ended it with a better understanding of the dangers of underestimating people based on surface appearances. That education might serve them well in future assignments, where such mistakes could have more serious consequences than embarrassment. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a number she recognized, the kind of secure communication that suggested her day's activities had already been noted by people who made it their business to track such things. Impressive demonstration today. New contracts available if you're interested in returning to active status. Rachel read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. She'd been down that road before, and the cost of that kind of work went beyond anything that could be measured in money. The skills were still there. Today had proven that beyond doubt, but the willingness to use them in their original context was something she'd left behind in places that officially didn't exist. But she couldn't entirely suppress a sense of satisfaction at having reminded a group of overconfident young soldiers that competence came in many forms, and that respect should be the default setting until someone proved they didn't deserve it. Back on the range, Cross was making his own discoveries. While cleaning equipment at the end of the duty day, he'd found a small piece of paper tucked under the bipod of the Barrett that Rachel had used for her demonstration. Written in precise handwriting were detailed ballistic calculations, elevation, and windage settings for various ranges, atmospheric conditions, and ammunition types. But these weren't the standard figures from manufacturer manuals. These were custom calculations that would squeeze every possible bit of accuracy from the weapon system, the kind of precision data that took years of experience to develop. At the bottom, in the same careful script, for the next generation, use wisely. No signature, no name, just the gift of knowledge from someone who'd spent a lifetime learning lessons that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Cross showed the paper to Chun, who immediately recognized its value. Within hours, it had been photocopied and distributed to every sniper in the unit. Within days, it would find its way to training facilities across multiple continents, studied by marksmanship instructors who would recognize the theoretical knowledge but wonder where it had originated. But none of them would ever meet the woman who'd written it. Rachel had already moved on to the next job, the next quiet assignment, the next opportunity to use skills that most people couldn't imagine and fewer still could master. And somewhere out there, soldiers would come home because their weapons shot a little truer, their equipment performed a little better, and their training had been touched, however briefly, by someone who'd spent a lifetime perfecting the art of precision. From the shadows. 3 days after Rachel's demonstration, the ripple effects were still spraying through Fort Braxton like waves from a stone dropped in still water. What had started as a single extraordinary moment was becoming something larger, a story that challenged assumptions and forced people to reconsider what they thought they knew about competence, recognition, and the difference between the two. Cross found himself the reluctant center of attention as word spread beyond the immediate witnesses. Officers from other units wanted details. Training instructors asked for technical specifications. Intelligence personnel made discreet inquiries about contractor backgrounds and security clearances. Each conversation forced him to relive those impossible moments, the casual way Rachel had shouldered the Barrett, the methodical precision of her shooting position, the absolute certainty in her movements that spoke of skills honed far beyond normal military training. You're telling me she made both shots without using a calculator, rangefinder, or ballistic computer? Major Patricia Hendricks asked during what was supposedly a routine training debrief. As the base's senior marksmanship instructor, she'd spent 20 years teaching soldiers how to hit targets at ranges most people considered impossible. She made sight adjustments by eye, compensated for mirage and wind drift manually, and shot groups that would be impressive at 300 meters, except she was shooting at over 3,000. Major Hendricks shook her head slowly. I've trained snipers who've gone on to set records in international competitions. I've worked with special operations personnel whose skills are classified. What you're describing is beyond either of those categories. That's what I keep trying to tell people. This wasn't just good shooting. This was something else entirely. Meanwhile, the young soldiers who'd witnessed the demonstration were processing their own reactions to having their assumptions so thoroughly challenged. Morrison and Murphy found themselves the subject of intense questioning from their peers, but also dealing with the uncomfortable realization that their casual mockery had revealed more about their own limitations than about their target. I keep thinking about how she just ignored us all morning, Murphy said during a quiet moment in the barracks. Not like she was angry or hurt, like we weren't worth the energy it would take to be offended. Morrison nodded grimly. And then, when she finally did respond, it wasn't with words. It was with that shot. Like she was saying, this is who I actually am, and your opinions never mattered anyway. The experience had shaken both young soldiers in ways they were still trying to understand. They'd enlisted with confidence in their abilities, earned their positions through demonstrated competence, and developed the kind of professional pride that came with being recognized as among the best in their field. But Rachel's demonstration had revealed the existence of levels of skill they hadn't even known were possible, achieved by someone who wore no uniform, displayed no rank, and seemed content to remain invisible until circumstances forced her to prove otherwise. Makes you wonder who else we've dismissed without really seeing, Murphy said quietly. How many people are out there with capabilities we can't even imagine, just because they don't fit our expectations of what competence looks like? Staff Sergeant Bryce was dealing with his own form of professional soul-searching. As a senior, non-commissioned officer, he'd built his authority on the assumption that he could accurately assess people's capabilities and potential. The previous Tuesday had shattered that confidence in ways that went beyond simple embarrassment. He'd requested a meeting with Colonel Williams, ostensibly to discuss training protocols, but really to try to understand how he'd so completely misjudged someone whose capabilities exceeded anything in their training manuals. Colonel, I need to understand how this happened, he said, sitting across from her desk with the uncomfortable posture of someone whose professional confidence had been fundamentally shaken. How does someone with those skills end up doing routine calibration work? And how did I completely miss the signs? Colonel Williams had been expecting this conversation. In her experience, good leaders learn from moments when their assumptions proved inadequate, while poor leaders made excuses or tried to minimize what had happened. Michael, I've been in the military for 30 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen skills like what was demonstrated on Tuesday. The people who possess those capabilities don't fit normal patterns, and they don't announce themselves in ways we're trained to recognize. She pulled up Rachel's heavily redacted file on her secure terminal. What I can tell you is that contractors like this don't end up in routine maintenance roles by accident. They choose those positions because they prefer anonymity over recognition. But why? With skills like that, she can have her choice of positions, recognition, advancement. Think about what level of operational experience would be required to develop that kind of marksmanship. Now think about what psychological cost that experience might carry. Some people reach a point where they've had enough of being visible, enough of being responsible for outcomes that matter on a strategic level. The colonel's words carried weight that went beyond simple explanation. She was describing people who'd operated at levels where success and failure were measured in lives saved or lost. where skills like Rachel's were developed through necessity, in situations that left permanent marks on those who survived them. She's not hiding from anything, Colonel Williams continued. She's choosing a different way to use her capabilities, one that lets her contribute without being at the center of operations that require her to make life-and-death decisions. That afternoon, Cross received an unexpected visitor at the range. Rachel had returned, not for scheduled maintenance work, but to collect some equipment she'd left behind. She moved through the facility with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown before, but now her presence carried an entirely different weight. "Sergeant Cross," she said, approaching where he was conducting routine training with a group of junior soldiers. "Can I speak with you privately for a moment?" They walked to a quiet corner of the facility, away from the curious glances of soldiers who'd heard about Tuesday's demonstration. Rachel carried herself with the same understated confidence as before, but Cross noticed details he'd missed during their first encounter. The way she automatically positioned herself with clear sight lines to all entrances, the unconscious assessment of cover and concealment options, the subtle hand positioning that would allow rapid access to equipment if necessary. "I wanted to thank you," she said without preamble. Cross looked confused. "Thank me for what?" "For treating Tuesday's demonstration as what it was, a professional display of specific skills, rather than turning it into entertainment or mythology." Her words carried an implication that suggested she dealt with unwanted attention before, the kind that turned competence into spectacle and made privacy impossible. "I've been doing this kind of work long enough to recognize the real thing when I see it," Cross replied. "What you demonstrated wasn't a party trick or a lucky shot. That was mastery earned through experience most of us can't imagine." Rachel nodded with the kind of acknowledgement that passed between professionals who understood each other's background without needing detailed explanations. "The calculations I left with the rifle," she continued, "those weren't just technical data. They were meant as a teaching tool, a way to help your soldiers understand that precision comes from understanding variables most people never consider. They've been studying those numbers like they're sacred texts. Several instructors have asked me where they came from." "Good. Maybe it will help them develop the patience and attention to detail that real marksmanship requires." "Maybe it will also help them understand that competence comes in many forms, and assumptions about people's capabilities are usually wrong." Cross sensed there was more she wanted to say, something that went beyond simple technical instruction or professional courtesy. "Can I ask you something?" he said carefully. Rachel waited with the kind of neutral attention that suggested she'd answer if the question was appropriate and ignore it if it wasn't. "The level of skill you demonstrated, that doesn't come from civilian training or weekend shooting courses. That comes from operational experience in places where precision matters in ways most people never have to think about." "That's not a question," Rachel observed, though her tone wasn't dismissive. "The question is whether you're satisfied with calibration work, or whether there's a part of you that misses using those skills in their original context." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful attention she'd given everything else. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions made and consequences accepted. "I'm satisfied with work that contributes to other people's success without requiring me to be responsible for outcomes I've been responsible for before. There's value in supporting excellence rather than being expected to embody it." The answer revealed more than she'd probably intended. Cross heard someone who'd operated at levels where individual performance had strategic consequences, who carried responsibilities that went beyond personal achievement to encompass the safety and success of others. "But you're still maintaining those skills," he observed. Tuesday proved that skills deteriorate without practice, and sometimes circumstances require their use in ways that weren't anticipated. She adjusted her equipment bag, signaling that the conversation was coming to an end. But before leaving, she offered one final piece of insight that would stay with Cross for the rest of his career. "Sergeant, the most dangerous mistake you can make in military service is assuming you understand people's capabilities based on their current assignment or apparent status. The people who've done the hardest jobs often prefer to remain invisible afterward. But that invisibility doesn't mean the capabilities are gone. It just means they're being used differently." As she walked away, Cross realized that Tuesday's demonstration hadn't just been about marksmanship. It had been about the difference between recognition and competence, about the gap between what people appeared to be and what they actually were, and about the wisdom of approaching everyone with respect until they proved they didn't deserve it. The lesson was one that would reshape how he evaluated people for the rest of his military career, and would eventually be passed on to hundreds of soldiers who would benefit from understanding that legends sometimes walked among them wearing unremarkable faces and civilian contractor badges. But first, there were more immediate consequences to Rachel's demonstration that were about to unfold in ways none of them had anticipated. 2 weeks after Rachel's demonstration, the story had taken on a life of its own. What started as whispered conversations in the Fort Braxton mess hall had spread through military social media, been embellished in barrack stories, and eventually reached the attention of people whose interest in exceptional marksmanship went far beyond academic curiosity. Rachel first became aware of the growing complications when she arrived at her next contracted job routine scope calibration at a National Guard facility in Nevada, to find that her reputation had preceded her. The facility commander, Colonel James Martinez, was waiting in the equipment bay with the kind of expectant smile that suggested he'd heard stories and was hoping for a repeat performance. "Ms. Hayes," he said, extending his hand with obvious enthusiasm, "I've heard some very interesting reports about your work at Fort Braxton. My instructors are quite eager to see a demonstration of the techniques that have been generating so much discussion." Rachel accepted the handshake with the sinking feeling of someone whose carefully maintained anonymity was dissolving despite her best efforts. "Colonel, I'm here to calibrate optical equipment, not to provide entertainment." Of course. But surely you understand that skills like yours represent a valuable training opportunity for our soldiers. It would be almost negligent not to take advantage of your presence here." The request was phrased politely, but Rachel recognized the underlying pressure. Word of her capabilities had reached levels where casual refusal wasn't really an option. She was being pulled back into the kind of visibility she'd spent years trying to avoid. Over the next several days, similar requests came from other sources. A private military contractor offered her a lucrative position that would require relocating to an undisclosed location. A government agency that didn't identify itself clearly requested her availability for specialized consultation work. A documentary filmmaker wanted to interview her about the hidden heroes of modern warfare. Each contact represented the kind of attention that made quiet anonymity increasingly difficult to maintain. Rachel found herself forced to decline opportunities that would have been career-defining for most people, simply because accepting them would destroy the carefully constructed privacy that allowed her to use her skills without carrying the psychological weight of high-stakes responsibility. The situation came to a head when she received a phone call from someone whose voice she recognized but hadn't heard in over 5 years. "Rachel, it's David Peterson. I think we need to talk." Peterson had been her handler during some of the most classified operations of her career, the kind of assignments that didn't appear in official records but had strategic consequences that rippled through entire theaters of operation. If he was calling, it meant her recent visibility had reached levels that threatened operational security for people who were still active. They met at a coffee shop in a small town outside Las Vegas, the kind of anonymous location where two people could have a serious conversation without attracting attention. Peterson looked older than she remembered, with the kind of weathered appearance that came from years of managing operations that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. "Your demonstration at Fort Braxton has created complications," he said without preamble. "People are asking questions about your background, your training, your previous assignments. Some of those questions are coming from sources that could compromise ongoing operations." Rachel had expected this conversation, but that didn't make it any less unwelcome. "I was trying to teach some young soldiers a lesson about making assumptions. I didn't anticipate it would generate this level of interest. The problem isn't what you did, it's how good you are at it. Skills like yours don't develop in civilian contexts, and people with sufficient security clearances are starting to connect dots that lead back to operations we prefer to keep buried." Peterson pulled out a tablet and showed her several articles that had appeared in military publications, blog posts that speculated about her background, and social media discussions that were getting uncomfortably close to accurate conclusions about her operational history. "We need to manage this situation before it spirals beyond our control," he said. "We have three options. You can accept a position that puts you back under official cover. You can relocate to somewhere far enough away that the story dies from lack of proximity, or we can arrange for the kind of definitive demonstration that ends speculation by making it clear that continued interest would be inadvisable." Rachel understood the implications of each option. The first would return her to the kind of high-stakes work she deliberately left behind. The second would require abandoning the life she'd carefully built in favor of starting over somewhere else. The third would involve using her skills in a way that sent a clear message of the consequences of unwanted attention. "There's a fourth option," she said quietly. Peterson waited with the patient attention of someone who'd learned that Rachel's unconventional solutions were usually worth hearing. "I finish my current contracts, complete my obligations professionally, and then disappear completely from this kind of work. No more military bases, no more government facilities, no more opportunities for people to witness skills that generate uncomfortable questions. That would mean giving up work you're exceptionally qualified for in favor of..." "What?" Rachel had been thinking about this possibility since the first unwanted phone call. "Private sector work that doesn't require security clearances or government facilities. Corporate training, civilian instruction, equipment consulting for companies that manufacture precision instruments. You'd be wasting capabilities that represent years of specialized training and operational experience. I'd be using those capabilities in ways that don't require me to carry responsibility for strategic outcomes or maintain operational security for classified programs." Peterson studied her with the expression of someone who was recognizing that this conversation represented the end of something that had been valuable to multiple government agencies. "Rachel, there are very few people who can do what you do at the level you do it. Walking away from that seems like a significant loss for national security interests. David, I spent 15 years being one of those few people. I've carried responsibilities that most people can't imagine, made decisions that affected outcomes I can't discuss, and dealt with consequences that I'll be processing for the rest of my life. I'm tired of being exceptional at things that require that kind of psychological cost." The weight of her words settled between them like a physical presence. Peterson had managed enough operations to understand what she was really saying, that skills like hers were developed through experiences that left permanent marks on the people who survived them, and that there came a point where the cost of maintaining those capabilities exceeded their strategic value. "If you disappear from this kind of work completely, what happens the next time there's a situation that requires your specific skill set?" Rachel's answer came without hesitation. carrying the finality of a decision that had been carefully considered and firmly made. Someone else will have to handle it. There are always other people, David. Maybe not as good, maybe not as experienced, but competent enough to get the job done. The world managed before I started doing this work, and it will manage after I stop. As she walked away from that coffee shop, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The lightness that came with making a decision that prioritized personal peace over professional obligation. The demonstration at Fort Braxton had inadvertently forced her to choose between continuing to use skills that defined her past and embracing a future that allowed her to move beyond them. The choice, when it came down to it, had been easier than she'd expected. But first, she had one more lesson to teach and one final demonstration to give, not of marksmanship this time, but of the kind of quiet dignity that comes with knowing when to walk away from something you're exceptionally good at in favor of something that allows you to sleep peacefully at night. Rachel's last contracted job took her back to Fort Braxton, completing a symmetry that felt both appropriate and final. The base commander had specifically requested her return to finish calibration work on equipment that had been upgraded since her previous visit. What Colonel Williams didn't mention in the official work order was that word of Rachel's pending retirement from military contract work had reached her through channels that didn't appear on organizational charts. When Rachel arrived on a Thursday morning, she found the range atmosphere notably different from her previous visit. The casual arrogance that had characterized her first encounter with the young soldiers was gone, replaced by a respectful attention that bordered on reverence. Word of her background had filtered through the unit, though the details remained appropriately vague. Cross was waiting for her at the equipment bench, along with several soldiers she recognized from her previous demonstration. But their body language had changed completely. Where before they'd lounged with casual dismissal, now they stood with the kind of alert respect typically reserved for visiting dignitaries or legendary instructors. "Miss Hayes," Cross said formally, "welcome back. We have several rifles that need your attention, and Colonel Williams has requested that you brief our advanced marksmanship students on precision shooting techniques before you complete your work here." Rachel set down her equipment bag and looked around at the assembled faces. Young soldiers who had learned, through her previous demonstration, that competence came in forms they hadn't expected and from sources they hadn't recognized. But she could also see something else in their expressions, the kind of eager anticipation that came from people who thought they were about to receive secrets that would transform their own capabilities. "I'm here to calibrate equipment," she said quietly, "not to teach courses that your regular instructors are perfectly qualified to handle." Morrison stepped forward, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by earnest respect. "Ma'am, we've been studying the calculations you left us. They've improved our accuracy significantly, but we know we're only scratching the surface of what's possible." "The surface is where most people operate successfully," Rachel replied, beginning to unpack her tools with the same methodical precision she'd shown before. "Going deeper requires experiences most of you wouldn't want to have." Her words carried an undercurrent that several of the more experienced soldiers recognized, the suggestion that exceptional skills came with costs that weren't immediately apparent to those who admired them from a distance. Murphy approached hesitantly. "Ma'am, we've heard that you're retiring from this kind of work. Is that true?" Rachel paused in her equipment setup to look at him directly. "It's true. This is my final military contract." "Because of what happened last time? Because we were disrespectful?" The question hung in the air with the weight of young people trying to understand whether their behavior had consequences beyond their immediate embarrassment. Rachel considered her response carefully, recognizing an opportunity to provide a different kind of education than what they were expecting. "No," she said simply, Because I've decided that the skills I developed in one context can be better used in different ways. And because maintaining anonymity has become impossible. She resumed her equipment work but continued talking as she made precise adjustments to scope mounts and cleaning mechanisms. You want to know what the most important lesson is from everything that happened during my last visit here? It's not about marksmanship techniques or ballistic calculations. It's about understanding that every person you encounter has capabilities you can't see, experiences you can't imagine, and reasons for their choices that you'll never fully understand. The soldiers gathered closer, sensing that this was the kind of instruction that wouldn't be available in any manual or classroom setting. The mockery you showed when I first arrived here wasn't unusual. It was human nature. People assess others based on immediate appearances and make assumptions about capabilities based on surface indicators. But those assumptions are wrong, more often than they're right, and the cost of being wrong can be significant. She moved to the next rifle, a precision instrument that someone had been neglecting based on carbon buildup and loose fittings. In operational contexts, underestimating people can get you killed. In social contexts, it can cost you opportunities to learn from people whose experiences could benefit you. In professional contexts, it can limit your ability to recognize competence in forms you weren't expecting. Cross found himself thinking about his own career, remembering times when he'd made similar assumptions about people whose quiet competence had later proved invaluable in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Ma'am," he said, "what should we have done differently?" Rachel looked up from the rifle she was servicing, meeting his eyes directly. "You should have treated me with the same professional respect you'd show anyone else doing specialized work. Competently. Not because you suspected I had hidden capabilities, but because respect should be your default setting until someone proves they don't deserve it." She returned to her work, but the lesson continued. The young man who called me grandmother on my first day here wasn't being malicious. He was being thoughtless. The difference matters, because malice requires correction, while thoughtlessness requires education. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, recognizing himself in her description. The same principle applies to everyone you'll encounter throughout your military careers. The quiet supply sergeant who processes your equipment requests might be a former special operations soldier who chose a rear echelon assignment after completing tours you can't imagine. The civilian contractor who maintains your vehicles might have 15 years of experience keeping military equipment operational in combat zones. Her words were reshaping how several of the soldiers thought about the support personnel they interacted with daily, people whose backgrounds and capabilities they'd never considered because their current roles seemed routine or unimportant. But the deepest lesson, Rachel continued, making a final adjustment to the rifle's optics, is that competence doesn't require recognition to be valuable. The most important work often happens without acknowledgement, and the people doing it prefer it that way. She finished her calibration work and began packing her tools with the same systematic precision she'd shown throughout the morning. "Ma'am," Murphy said quietly, "will we see you again?" Rachel shouldered her equipment bag and looked around at the faces that had been transformed by education rather than humiliation. Young soldiers who had learned something about respect, assumptions, and the hidden depths that existed in everyone they encountered. "Probably not," she said, "but you'll see other people who deserve the kind of respect you've learned to show. And when you do, you'll remember that competence comes in many forms, that assumptions about people are usually wrong, and that treating everyone with professional courtesy costs nothing but can teach you everything." She walked toward the exit, but paused at the gate to deliver one final observation. "The calculations I left you last time will improve your marksmanship significantly if you apply them correctly. But the real gift I'm leaving you is the understanding that legends walk among you every day, wearing ordinary faces and doing ordinary jobs, and that your assumptions about them say more about your limitations than about their capabilities." As she disappeared through the gate, Cross realized that Rachel's final visit had accomplished something more valuable than equipment calibration or marksmanship instruction. She had provided an education in human dignity, professional respect, and the kind of wisdom that could only come from someone who had operated at exceptional levels and chosen to move beyond them. The soldiers who remained behind would carry those lessons throughout their careers, approaching everyone they encountered with the kind of respectful attention that recognized hidden depths and unacknowledged competence. And somewhere in the civilian world, Rachel would continue using her exceptional skills in ways that contributed to others' success without requiring her to carry the psychological weight of strategic responsibility. The legend of her demonstration would continue to grow in military circles, but the woman herself had successfully returned to the anonymity she preferred, leaving behind only the memory of impossibility made routine and the enduring lesson that respect should always be the default setting when encountering quiet competence. 6 months after Rachel Hayes walked away from military contract work for the final time, her influence continued to ripple through Fort Braxton and beyond in ways that would have surprised her. The story of the quiet contractor who'd made impossible shots had evolved into something larger, a teaching tool that instructors used to challenge assumptions, and a reminder that competence often hid behind unremarkable appearances. Cross, now promoted to staff sergeant, found himself using Rachel's demonstration as the centerpiece of a leadership course he'd developed on recognizing and respecting hidden capabilities. The young soldiers who'd witnessed her shooting had become some of the most thoughtful and respectful troops on the base. Their approach to support personnel and civilian contractors, permanently altered by the memory of how wrong their initial assumptions had been. The most dangerous mistake you can make, Cross would tell new arrivals during orientation, is thinking you understand someone's capabilities based on their current assignment or apparent status. Treat everyone with professional respect, because you never know who might teach you something that changes your entire perspective. Murphy and Morrison, now both corporals themselves, had become unofficial ambassadors for this philosophy throughout their unit. The casual mockery that had once characterized their interactions with support staff had been replaced by genuine curiosity about people's backgrounds and experiences. "It's weird," Murphy confided to Morrison during a quiet moment between training exercises. "Ever since that day with the contractor, I find myself really looking at people differently. Like the guy who cleans our weapons in the armory. Turns out he served 3 tours in Iraq as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist. The woman who handles our supply requests was a combat medic for 8 years before she had kids and switched to civilian work." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Makes you wonder how many stories we've missed because we never bothered to ask, or because we assumed we already knew what people were capable of." The ballistic calculations Rachel had left behind had taken on an almost sacred status among the base's marksmanship instructors. They'd been incorporated into the advanced training curriculum, studied by visiting specialists from other installations, and eventually included in updated field manuals that would influence training protocols across multiple military branches. But perhaps more importantly, they'd become a symbol of the kind of knowledge that could only be gained through experience. The understanding that precision required patience, attention to detail, and respect for variables that most people never considered. Colonel Williams kept a framed copy of those calculations in her office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the lesson Rachel had inadvertently taught about leadership and judgment. The incident had forced her to examine her own assumptions about personnel evaluation and had led to changes in how the base assessed civilian contractors and support staff. "We were missing talent because we weren't looking for it in the right places," she'd written in a report that would eventually influence military human resources policies. Exceptional capabilities don't always announce themselves in conventional ways, and our evaluation processes needed to account for that reality. Meanwhile, Rachel had successfully transitioned to civilian work that used her skills, without requiring security clearances or government facilities. She'd established a small consulting business that provided precision equipment calibration for corporate clients, law enforcement agencies, and competitive shooting organizations. The work was satisfying in ways that her previous assignments had never been. Technically challenging, but without the psychological weight of strategic consequences. Her clients valued her expertise without needing to know the operational history that had developed it, and she was free to use her capabilities in ways that contributed to others' success without carrying responsibility for life and death outcomes. Occasionally, she would receive messages from former colleagues or military personnel who'd heard stories about her demonstration at Fort Braxton. Most were respectful inquiries about her availability for consultation work or training programs. A few were more pressing requests from government agencies facing situations that required her specific skill set. She declined them all politely but firmly, maintaining the boundary she'd established between her past capabilities and her chosen future. The skills remained sharp through regular practice, but they were no longer available for the kind of high-stakes applications that had defined the first part of her career. One evening, while calibrating equipment for a client who manufactured precision optics for civilian markets, Rachel received a call from Cross. He tracked down her business number through channels she preferred not to examine too closely. "Ms. Hayes, I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted you to know what's happened since your last visit to Fort Braxton." Rachel listened as he described the changes in attitude among the soldiers, the incorporation of her ballistic data into training programs, and the broader cultural shift toward respecting support personnel and civilian contractors. "The lesson you taught has had more impact than any formal training program we've ever implemented," he concluded. "These soldiers are better leaders and better people because of what they learned from watching you handle disrespect with dignity and competence." After ending the call, Rachel reflected on the unexpected legacy of her final military demonstration. She'd intended to teach a simple lesson about not underestimating people based on appearances. Instead, she'd apparently catalyzed a broader understanding of respect, competence, and the hidden depths that existed in everyone. The irony wasn't lost on her that walking away from recognition had ultimately created more positive impact than years of acknowledged excellence had achieved. By choosing anonymity over visibility, she'd become a more powerful example than she'd ever been while operating at the highest levels of classified work. Her current life offered satisfactions that her previous career had never provided. The piece of work that didn't require constant vigilance, the satisfaction of problems that could be solved without strategic consequences, and the simple pleasure of competence that served others without demanding recognition in return. But perhaps most importantly, it offered the knowledge that her final military demonstration had created ripple effects that would benefit countless soldiers throughout their careers, teaching them to approach everyone with the kind of respectful attention that recognized hidden capabilities and honored quiet competence. As she returned to her equipment calibration work, Rachel felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she'd found the right balance between using her exceptional skills and maintaining the personal peace that made life worth living. The legend of that impossible shot would continue to grow in military storytelling, inspiring respect for unassuming competence and challenging assumptions about what people were capable of achieving. But the woman who'd made the shot had successfully disappeared back into the shadows she preferred, leaving behind only the memory of precision made routine and the enduring lesson that the most dangerous people were often the quietest ones. And somewhere in those shadows, she continued to work with the same methodical excellence that had always defined her approach to precision, not for glory or recognition, but for the simple satisfaction of doing exceptional work exceptionally. Well, one careful adjustment at a time. The story would live on in the whispered conversations of soldiers who learned to look twice before making assumptions, in the respectful treatment of support personnel who might be carrying hidden depths, and in the understanding that legends walked among them every day, wearing ordinary faces and asking only for the professional courtesy that should be everyone's default setting. Sometimes the most powerful lessons were taught by people who never intended to teach them. And sometimes the greatest impact came from those who preferred to remain invisible while quietly changing how others saw the world around them. Rachel Hayes had achieved both, and in doing so, had created a legacy that would outlast any official recognition or public acknowledgement. The legacy of quiet competence honored, assumptions challenged, and respect earned through the simple act of being exceptionally good at something while refusing to make it about anything other than the work itself. In the end, that was exactly the kind of legacy she'd hoped to leave behind. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever completely misjudged someone based on first impressions? What would you have done if you were standing there when Rachel made that impossible shot? Share your thoughts and experiences with us. Your stories and interactions help us create even better content for this incredible community we're building together.